I'm not in a rush. I got the rest of tonight blocked for this.
All right. So, first thing, how you been?
I've been doing fine. I have been doing some more foreign policy work on my channel. I've been doing a lot of um, book summaries because I just feel like those are really productive. Um, I get a lot out of that. Um, that is what I'm staying busy with channel wise. Other than that, doing very well. Trying to diversify also. I'm on Library now, and everything is on BitChute and archive.org and minds.com as well. So, yeah, I am doing fine, man. How are things with you going?
All right. It's just COVID, so not much going on. Being safe is being boring. So,
It is. It is. Yeah, definitely trying to find the balance between, making sure that I stay on top of things with work and, having the friends life is a tough balance to find.
hmm. For anyone here who's not familiar, we're here with Keith Knight. I'm just gonna give a very rough, bad description, and if I get anything wrong, just stop me. Keith Knight is a narco-capitalist YouTuber. Uh, Actually, is that all accurate so far?
So far, so good.
Okay. Now, do you find that the label actually that was the question? Sorry. Do you find the label anarcho-capitalist is a good one, or do you find that that's has some connotations with it that you don't ascribe to?
It's an unfortunate term because for those who understand it, we're good. But there is a lot of confusion. What I mean by anarcho capitalist is one part anarchism, which is a word coming from the Greek an, meaning without, and archons, rulers. In other words, it is wrong for someone to claim rulership over another person. This does not outlaw voluntary contracts, agreements, rules, or criteria for how people act on any property you have or any property you've acquired through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. So that is the anarchist part, basically a society without a state or any group that has a double standard. If one group has the right to do things like Congress that no other group does, that is in effect one group ruling over the rest of society. That is why I'm an anarchist. The capitalist part is a definition you can derive by understanding communism, which is the abolition of private property, socialism, which is the institutionalized coercive interference between private property owners and non aggressive contracts between consenting adults. And then with those two definitions, you end up with capitalism or free market or voluntarism being the antithesis of socialism, statism, and coercive interference. So, capitalism would, in effect, be a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property rights and non aggressive contractual exchanges between consenting adults. That is why I have no problem with the term anarcho capitalist. I see it as interchangeable with libertarian, voluntarist, anarchist, natural law advocate, libertarian, free market advocate. I would say all those are interchangeable, and that's my justification.
All right. So if you guys would like to ask any questions, right above this voice chat, there's the Keith Knight AMA. Just write your questions in there. So off the bat, um, what do you think about Joe Jorgensen, and will you be voting for Joe?
I'm actually not registered to vote, which I thought I was, but turns out I'm not. I'm not going out of my way to vote and become a registered voter just because it's too much effort for, I mean, virtually something that I have no even reason to believe that the votes are counted accurately. They're done in secret by a group that's not accountable. I don't want to get into it because it might actually implicate someone, but the one time I was at a voting poll on in the election was in 2014 in Chandler, Arizona. I was there for 5 minutes and witnessed voter fraud right in front of my face. So when I see that on top of it sort of generating legitimacy for the existence of a state, I think that's a little ridiculous. I think a much better approach would be just to communicate the ideas and change public opinion. Now, I don't want to avoid the Jo Jorgensen aspect of this. I think she is definitely a net benefit to freedom. I mean, some of the stuff she says is just ridiculous. There was a tweet about her, her saying it's good that Kamala Harris got in because politics shouldn't be a boys' club. Good for her. I mean, even if you want women to be involved in politics, that would be the worst example of, hey, at least we have a woman in there, because it's the ultimate. We don't have standards any woman will do. I'd say the same thing about Sarah Palin. Whereas I think I think Carrie Wedler is a YouTuber. It's either Wedler or Welder. She is probably one of the best voices for libertarianism out there. So I love that women or anyone is involved in there. But for Jorgensen to say that, I just thought that was a little annoying. But I had Jorgensen on my show, and we talked for about 30 minutes. She's good on libertarianism, understands why the state is illegitimate, claims rights that no other organization has, and initiates violence against peaceful people because they claim the right to do so by writing words down on paper and then voting. Something absolutely ridiculous if any other organization tried to pull off a scheme like that. So I think she's without question a net benefit. And back to the voting thing, when I say I'm not a voter because it sort of legitimizes the state, I really do see that it's almost selling yourself short for something that's virtually meaningless. I mean, look, if you got a government job where you'd be able to sort of influence and then be seen as legitimate and having credentials and being able to spread the message of freedom as someone with those credentials, sure. Even if it's coercively funded, well, you're only getting some of your stolen money. But I mean, to sell yourself for a 1 in 200 million vote that's probably not even counted, that's just too insulting to participate in. And it certainly recognizes the legitimacy of an organization that, I mean, even when you do get wins like, Obama's going to at least close Guantanamo Bay and improve relations with other countries, does the exact opposite. At least Trump is going to, shrink the government a little bit. Nope, does the opposite, more spending than virtually any other president, even in the last year or so. So, no, I don't vote because it legitimizes the state and it is virtually meaningless in a larger context. I think the focus for freedom advocates should be to change popular opinion in just holding the state to the same principles you would hold any other organization to. It's so complex, yet so simple at the same time.
All right, so before we get into Dusky's question, I want to just a couple here about voting. Jordan wants to know: do you think voting against taxation is aggression?
No. And the reason I say that is because if someone is initiating aggression, I think you need to warn them, hey, stop doing that. If you don't, I am going to use force to stop you from doing so. And I would never think of using force to stop someone from voting. Yes, it's a terrible ritualistic, but I mean, saying the pledge in public, I think does just as much to legitimize the state as voting. And I would never cage someone for doing that or, point a gun at them and tell them to stop. Whereas I would absolutely do that for a home invasion, a rape, a murder, a kidnapping, someone trying to enslave another person, someone assaulting another person. Those blatant acts of aggression, absolutely, you have the right to defend yourself. But no, voting is not aggression, even though it does sort of give a hat tip to the aggressors. But I mean, the worst thing you could do is go on CNN and or Fox or MSNBC or ABC and justify the existence of a state. That does way more to legitimize the state in the minds of the masses than having a 1 in 10 million vote that, I mean, heaven knows, even if when the decision is made versus how long it takes to count all the ballots, something like by the time half the ballots are in, there's a 98% chance they know what the result's going to be. just too ridiculous for me to even spend time participating in. I think for every second I worry about that stuff, that's time that I could be spending making a video explaining the reality of the situation to someone.
All right, and Hacked Duck wants to know: could you bring about anarcho-capitalism through the ballot?
Through the, you know what, I don't necessarily think so, because through the ballot wouldn't necessarily change the mind of the individual. So currently, the problem is that the voters believe that violence isn't violence when a group called government does it. Their theft is called taxation. Their mass murder is called war. Their enslavement is called the draft. Their violent domination is called regulation. So the reality is that the problem is in the minds of the voters. So if the voters vote for anarcho-capitalism, and that makes it legitimate only because it occurred through the mechanism of voting, well, that's not necessarily changing their minds and getting them to have a deep understanding of what makes statism immoral. It would be the equivalent of saying, if a bunch of Muslims voted for Christianity, would that make them Christian? Well, no. What it would do is just say that a majority of them voted for Christianity compared to something else, but it wouldn't change the belief in their hearts that they still recognize Allah over Jesus, or I'm sorry, Muhammad over Jesus as being the prophet. So again, just as you can't vote someone's religion away, or you can't just vote someone out of a Jonestown cult, you have to really just explain the principal difference to them. So I don't think that it can. I think if it ever did exist through ballots, it would simply be a reflection of what already exists in the minds of people, as opposed to well, there was a vote for anarcho-capitalism and now everyone has it, and this is just the way it is. Because if you just took down the government, people would just start seeking a new government the next day. So I don't see that as a principled solution. However, it is possible. I just think it's very unlikely.
Okay. Dusky wants to know: what's your best response against the fear of warlordism? And they specify not against status. That's extremely easy, since they want a state, but against left anarchists who claim that security companies, prisons, banks, etc., can come together and form a dictatorship.
Sure. It is funny when statists bring that up as if warlords don't occur under statism.
Oh,
Statism has the biggest.
Real quick, his question was specifically about warlordism, and like what's your response to it when it's proffered by left anarchists? So people who say, like, basically we got to worry about the corporations.
Sure. If there was a belief in the right to rule, then a corporation very well could just replace a state, and then the corporation would be the state. But we have to remember, what makes the state legitimate is it has different moral characteristics. As big as Amazon is, they're very big and they're very influential, but I don't think there certainly is no large-scale recognized right that Amazon has the right to do something that no one else does. In the same way, Jay-Z and Kanye West have 1 billion times more influence than I do. They don't have any more recognized rights than I do, specifically the right to initiate aggression against peaceful people. So long as corporations do not, one, have the recognized right to rule, they simply will not become warlords, because people won't be looking for someone to rule them over. In fact, the introduction of anarchism is what decreases this. If you had the belief in statism and no separation of church and state, we'd have warlords between Protestants and Muslims and Jews, because they would all want their religion to be coercively imposed so they could enjoy it at everyone else's expense. When you have an embracement of free market ideas, you don't recognize security companies as having extra rights than anyone else. They wouldn't have the ability to, disarm millions of people and force them to fund them, because you just don't have that recognition. You don't control schools where people pledge their allegiance to your corporation. I mean, corporations would have to spend I don't know what, trillions of dollars a year just to indoctrinate people, and it simply would not economically be worth it. You'd have to spend so much time investing in something that no one believed in. So I don't see that as a legitimate threat. I also don't see how left anarchism solves this, because you could have mini warlords, you could have Amish warlords. I'm not even entirely sure what the leftist critique of that would be. I guess it's just corporations would engage in profit-seeking measures. Therefore, they would use this profit to justify initiating violence against peaceful people. Yeah, it could happen. In the same way, terrible things could happen under any society. It's much less likely to happen in a society that embraces private property, recognizes competition, and does not recognize anyone's right to rule peaceful people. Does that answer the question, or did I just avoid the whole thing?
Um, I think so, but just to push back on it, you were talking about if I understand what you're saying right, is that we wouldn't need to worry about warlords because there wouldn't be widespread recognition of their legitimacy. Is that an accurate characterization of your point?
Yes, it is. And let's say that warlords would exist in the same way spousal abuse might exist and kidnapping. Under which, if we are anti-warlord, what system should we embrace to drastically decrease the likelihood of a warlord arising? That system would be a system where there's no of anarchism, no recognition of the right to rule, and capitalism or free market voluntarism, where there is private property embraced. Any other system that justifies authority right away, that is a warlord by definition. And any system that is a leftist or socialist, quote, anarchist idea, that means they justify forcibly stopping people from making voluntary exchanges under the guise that exploitation might be occurring and profit might be disproportionately given to one party or another. So that is much more of a warlord situation, where the socialist says a worker can't contract with an entrepreneur because the entrepreneur is going to make more money than the other person. You might as well be a warlord if you're telling people how to live their life and they can't make a voluntary exchange. So I'm anti-warlord. I think anarcho-capitalism is, in principle and practice, the philosophy we should embrace if we want to have no warlords.
But don't, like, just what we have seen in the past, don't warlords normally lack publicly accepted legitimacy?
Not necessarily. They're seen as a competing government as opposed to just a private organization doing what they want. For example, Somalia is a big warlord geographical area where people are having competing governments, which is still a recognition of the right to rule. It's competing statism versus anarchism. That is completely different in principle. It's like saying Protestants and Catholics fighting is the same as atheism. No, atheism is completely different from those two religions going to war. So in the same way, anarchism is completely different than states fighting for geographical areas. I think warlords are constantly seen as legitimate saviors with extra rights, and their murder is just, murder on the behalf of a virtuous idea that hopefully can be embraced by the nation. I don't see warlords as having institutionalized legitimacy. Even if they do, then the goal is to make sure you hold the warlords or whoever they are to the same standards you'd hold anyone else to. And that would mean that you have the right to resist them.
All right. So, for what it's worth, Joel, the person who asked it, said that he's satisfied with the answer and thinks that you actually answered it.
Okay. Well, thank you for letting me know that, because I definitely I appreciate people's time, and I don't want them to ask a question and me just screw them out of their efforts.
All right. So, next question is from Dusky. How do we prove self-ownership the basis of the NAP?
The way you can justify self-ownership, I believe, is simply by saying you, with regards to others, have a better claim to your body than other people do. So if we just have person A and person B, either they have self-ownership. A owns A and B owns B. If we have anything that deviates from that, A owns a percentage of B. Well, then B has to own a percentage of A. And until A gets B's permission, A cannot act. This gets us into an inherent contradiction. Or if everyone owns everyone, then obviously everyone's enslaved to everyone else. So the only consistent approach to having a view of the morally justified way for a society to run or for people to interact, in the same way we would need to find consistency in how objects fall to have a theory of matter. In order to have a theory of ethics, unless it applies consistently and can be practiced in the real world, I think it's completely illegitimate. So the reason I think self-ownership is justified is because I have a better claim to my body with regards to other people until I have, say, initiated aggression against someone else and the property that they have justly acquired. So because I am the genesis of my actions, I am also responsible for those actions. That's why if I commit murder, it's not like, well, you only are 50% of a self-owner, so let's have other people also go to jail with you. Because you don't own yourself, you're not fully responsible. It's like, no, we should just have the jail system that we have and apply it consistently. I'm responsible for my actions. If I contract with someone and they choose to give me their property that they've justly acquired, then that property becomes mine. And then I have, with regards to others, a better claim to that property. So because I am the sole decider of how I can operate my body, it gives me a better claim to my body than others. Doesn't mean I don't do stupid things or irrational things. It means that even though I might have a bad claim or a weak justification for how I choose to live my life, it's still a hell of a lot better than the claim that anyone else has. So if only I directly control my body, you cannot directly control my body. You can only control me by first directly controlling yourself. Then you could indirectly, forcibly move my arm by you engaging in the act of self-ownership. So if we don't have self-ownership, we are basically saying some people have rights that other people do not. And before you act, you don't own your body, so you have to get permission from other people, because you can't just do whatever you want with your body. You have to take a vote, and then the voters decide what happens. Well, how come they get to vote? They get to choose to vote, but I don't get to choose to open up a business or build a porch on my own property or have a commercial exchange without the state or ruling class coercively involving themselves. So because self-ownership is the only consistently ethically applied idea, is what makes it morally legitimate and superior to ideas of socialism, fascism, or collectivism.
All right. And Sushi Lover wants to know, have you ever considered voice acting Robin from the DC universe?
Voice acting Robin, I actually am not familiar with that reference, unfortunately. If he wants to send me a video clip on Twitter, I am at @AN_capitalist. I think that's funny. So I will take a look at something like that.
That'd be funny. Dusky wants to know, let's see, I'll go through his other ones first. Oh, jeez, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. When do people start having self-ownership, and by that logic, consistency, don't animals also own themselves?
So at what age people come to own themselves, I think there's definitely a lot of ambiguity. I mean, certainly it's not age 1, and it's also not age 80. At what age is it exactly? I think a principled response to that would be, once someone displays rational characteristics and an ability to see, I don't want to say long term, but the ability to weigh ideals with reality would be an explanation or justification for that person being a self-owner and having the right to leave their parents' house without their parents forcibly stopping them. I do, of course, and this is what makes consenting adults different from kids. When a child, and this is not to just pick on kids, children do not have the mental capacity to consent to things like a mortgage or a long-term payment plan or sex. This is what makes pedophilia immoral, but sex between adults totally justified. So because they don't have the mental capacity to consent is what disqualifies them from being self-owners. So in the same way, someone in a coma, I do not think has self-ownership. If someone has an epileptic attack and hits me, that's not the same as someone assaulting me, because that person does not have control over their agency. There certainly is a lot of gray areas. This is what comes with, being a human, and there being large degrees of certain concepts. There is a spectrum of autism. I'm sure there is a spectrum of ownership where there are a lot of 14-year-olds that could live on their own. There are 29-year-olds that are absolute idiots and need to be taken care of, or should be taken care of through any voluntary method. There are some people who are mentally challenged. It's not like you either are or aren't. There's also a spectrum there. So I would say the idea, the ability to demonstrate concepts and what should be from what really is, and your ability to act in accordance with ideals would be a demonstration of someone who I would hold accountable for self-ownership. So I wouldn't put a 10-year-old in jail, for hitting someone, but I would put a 30-year-old in jail for assault. Now, it's important to recognize this is a rough conversation just because it can be vague getting into at what point exactly is someone responsible and able to do things that they previously were not able to do. That's really tough and hard to bog down. The fact that that's hard to bog down applies to anarcho-capitalism, but it also applies to statism, minarchism, fascism, communism, socialism, anarcho-syndicalism. So it's inherently something that's difficult to deal with. It in no way justifies a state or anything else. Because, if we're just talking about age of consent laws, that difficulty applies to anarcho-capitalism and communism and fascism and minarchism and everything else. But I appreciate the question, because it's definitely something that I wish there would be more work on. I'm just sort of going what I've thought about previously, and is what is coming to my head now.
All right. Next question from Joel. He wants to know, do you think that people like Hop fall in terms of being traditional, or do you think the benefit of tradition is necessary for anarcho-capitalism?
I am really not sure what changes people's minds. I think the work of psychologists like Robert Cialdini have certainly made very persuasive cases that the vast majority of decisions that we make are irrational and unjustifiable. We first make our decision and then later fabricate justifications in our head. So I think it's very likely that when we have a decent tradition like Christianity, I think it's definitely important to value that. Certainly institutions like the Catholic Church, Mormonism, voluntary organizations, these are just things that we need to absolutely, and when I say we, I just mean but people who subscribe to the private law voluntarism anarchist ideology that I do. I think we absolutely have to appreciate those and hold on to them. Family. What we're essentially doing is we're competing for the hearts, minds, and the public opinion of pretty much the planet, because nations are just arbitrary differences between people that have the same rights. So when it comes to something like the Soviet Union losing communism, Vladimir Putin's talking with Oliver Stone, and Oliver Stone sort of said, "Why did you make Russia Christian?" And Putin says, well, first of all, that's something the Russian people decided to do on their own merit. And it was a belief that arose because after communism fell, people needed something to believe in. And when I saw that, I'm just like, that was just a blowing away moment for me, because it is so true that people, unfortunately, simply are exchanging one prejudice for another, as opposed to having a really consistent, principled idea. So, I mean, you can get rid of, forcing someone to pick cotton against their will and it's celebrated, but then you force someone to go fight a war against their will under the guise of the draft or conscription. And we're like, well, thank God for that. And that's just them paying back society for the fact that they benefit. So unfortunately, in what we're dealing with is people exchanging one prejudice for another and not having principled differences when they, quote, change their opinion. So I definitely appreciate a lot of traditions, but at the same time, the fact that something is old and has been done by a lot of people for a long time in no way is a moral justification. So of these institutions should not be above criticism, of course, but I definitely think they should be valued. But then again, I could totally see another approach being, instead of embracing traditionalism, let's move forward. Let's go past the idea of people having the right to rule each other and make sure only voluntary interactions are justified in our society. So I could see the appeal of anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism being the result of people embracing tradition and saying, we need to go back to our roots of family and people interacting socially. And all we have to do is take this beautiful tradition and introduce voluntarism. Or I could see it being, we need drastic changes. We need to embrace a philosophy where there is no central bank, no group that writes words down and gets to violently impose them on everyone else. I could see it really going both ways, both the traditional appeal and the we need drastic change appeal. Because again, when we're fighting for authority figures, we're basically saying you should choose the ideas of voluntarism over the ideals of statism. So when someone believes in government, the problem is they don't have enough intellectual competition. So when the state tells them to murder someone, they will either applaud it or thank someone for their service, instead of really thinking, well, I was always raised, thou shalt not murder. Shouldn't I hold government to that same standard? I was always told, thou shalt not steal. If I become a congressman, does that give me the right that I previously didn't have? So the fact that there are competing allegiances for authority, I think, is a great foundation for libertarianism to be built upon. But hey, I'm open to it either being the result of progress or an appeal to tradition, so long as but people understand the concept. I'm totally on board. I think Hoppa's done terrific work in recognizing that it's not only through rationality. Sometimes it's just introducing competition, and then people 100 years later stating that, oh yeah, they never believed that anyways. I mean, I don't think there was necessarily a moral change in people's hearts and minds for slavery. The vast majority of people are just passively accept the ideas that are fed to them and say that, oh yeah, I would have believed in this anyways, for some fake justification.
All right. Hyperion wants to know, being how there is an array of ability inherent in the human condition, aren't we assuming their ability to be all rational enough to form a civilization in an anarchic paradigm?
Not necessarily. Let's say new scientific evidence emerges that people are 100% irrational and they don't make good decisions for themselves in the short run, medium realm, or the long run. And they're ignorant about history, just completely ignorant. I don't see how the existence of everyone being massively ignorant justifies a state. Certainly, the state would be, I'm assuming, filled with human beings. And if human beings are irrational and idiots and not able to look to the long term for their ideas, I don't see how the existence of a state changes anything. If anything, that would exacerbate irrationality, because it's bad enough if I'm irrational, but if I'm irrational and I have the right to rule other people, oh Jesus, watch out. Then I have, armies that just take my orders blindly. Uh, and I am also irrational just like everyone else. So whether people are pure good, well, then you certainly don't need a state because everyone's good. And if everyone's all evil, well, make sure you don't have a state so the evil people can't exacerbate their evil under the guise of having the right to rule others. And if people are, a mix of both, well, make sure there's not a state because the most evil human beings ever are sucked to the state like a goddamn bat signal. I mean, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, that's just in America. What's the likelihood that all these dictators, totally justify mass murder, even when they have the internal documents showing that it's going on? The greatest psychopaths on the planet are able to massively amplify their evil because they occupy this position where there are not principles held to them that they otherwise would. I mean, if Jeff Bezos orders Amazon to murder people, we would rightly see him as evil and he would hopefully be assassinated. But if Trump does it, people say, thank God for Trump, or else, bad people would be out there. I mean, at what point are people going to say that a nation's actions are unjustified if they currently support that politician? Literally, if Obama had nuked countries, under the guise of protecting us, and it's for the greater good, and there were dictators in those countries, so I was really helping them out, I don't think people would change their mind. I certainly don't think if Trump started nuking countries indiscriminately that I think it would be so easy to fool people and say, well, at least it's him and not someone else, it might be better. So that is that is my immediate response to, what if people are evil or irrational. I don't see whether they're totally rational, not rational at all, or some mixture. I don't see how that justifies a state. It's the equivalent of saying people are irrational, therefore Apple, the company, has the right to rule people. Well, every criticism of the average person also applies to the people that are involved with Apple or Congress or the Catholic Church or the Red Cross or the Symington Cancer Center, any other organization. So while that might be true, people are very irrational, it in no way justifies a state. If anything, it is an argument against the existence of statism and the double standard that some people have the right to rule and others have a duty or obligation to obey that rule.
All right, so there's a question from Dusky. I'm going to rephrase it to, I think, better capture the point he's trying to get at. If self-ownership is the basis of rights and people under a certain age lack the necessary requirements for self-ownership, I think you said it's the ability to reason, then what is the moral wrong in causing harm to them?
The moral wrong in causing harm to them is their nature of being a human being that has the potential for self-ownership, as well as the ability to experience pain and trauma. So that is my immediate response to that. I certainly would have to give it a lot of thought. But for example, assaulting a child is immoral, even though the child is not a self-owner. One, because this is a traumatizing experience and can cause them long-term damage. Whereas if if you force a baby to take a bath and they don't want to, I would say you're justified in forcing them against their will simply because they don't have the understanding that they need to engage in hygiene. Or if they want to eat all the Krispy Kreme donuts they can, forcibly stopping them is justified simply because it causes them significant amounts of harm that they're not able to correctly see. You would have the same right to stop a parent from engaging in this abuse against a child. So I could see the parent relationship, whether it's parent-child or adult, or let's say rational adult versus mentally challenged adult, simply as a steward. So one who's able to compensate for the shortcomings that individual is experiencing. So if someone's in a coma, well, there needs to be large compensation. If someone isn't totally there mentally, for example, the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, if someone's not there, well, then you constantly have to have a handler helping them out, making up for their shortcomings. Sometimes, if in the same way, if you have really bad sight, you would want someone to forcibly stop you every now and then, so you don't walk over a curb and fall, so you don't walk into traffic. That would be justified simply because the blind person doesn't have the ability to fully see, just like the child doesn't fully have the ability to realize what they're doing is harmful, just as the mentally challenged person doesn't have the rationality to see the long-term or even immediate effects of their actions. So while the child still is a self-owner in the sense that it's wrong to initiate aggression against them, I still think that they are a self-owner, and this is justified because they are simply experiencing a temporary shortcoming to their rationality that in a matter of years, we are able to see that they will become a self-owner eventually. That is my justification. And I know I've already said this, but that's a great question that I'm very interested in doing some more thinking about. But again, the fact that it's a shortcoming for ANCAPs, it's also a shortcoming for every other political ideology and does not justify a state.
So you would say then that there are rights which arise without self-ownership. Is that right?
Rights that, yeah, I think any human being, I would put this species of human beings in a sphere in which it is wrong to initiate aggression against them because they have a better claim to their body than others. So therefore, people have the right to live their lives the way they want so long as they don't initiate coercion or fraud. Both of these violate the consent of other people by their very nature. So it violates the self-ownership of other people. So yes, I would say that rights can exist in the absence of total self-ownership. And the case in that would be, a baby, just a newborn baby that has no ability to, control thoughts, actions, or emotions in a rational manner. I would still think it's wrong to kill that baby because I put them in the sphere of human beings where the morally permissible behavior is virtually anything that does not initiate aggression or long-term harm against the interests of the child. Again, that gets into a lot of muddy waters. At what point is it in the interest of the baby? Again, that applies to every other ideology, which I'm certainly open to being corrected about, but it in no way justifies a state.
All right. Jordan wants to know, what are your thoughts on Hoppians that argue private property is being a king or ruler of your property and makes the case for anarcho-monarchism?
So it's not that he makes the case for the ideal society being, I'm sorry, he might in the sense of if you're the king of your house, then you're a monarch of your house. I think it really engages in the equivocation fallacy and shortcoming that when we say king, what we mean is a person who rules over others, not a person who is a self-owner. So I disagree with the terminology. As far as I think it's an interesting way to argue or to prove a point that if you say I believe the president should have this power or the king should have this power, you could say I think everyone should be a king. I'm just an equality person, so everyone should be king of themselves and they should be king of all the property that they justly acquire. That's just a different idea on how to word the ideas of self-ownership, but I do think that is misleading. Certainly, there is no principal difference. So long as people understand the difference between Putin being head of Russia and my friend who lives in Russia who owns his house. The reason my friend owns his house and gets to make all the rules in his house is because he acquired that house justly through voluntary exchange and original appropriation, meaning he worked to labor it. Therefore, with regards to others, he has a better claim to it. So because he has that just acquisition, he can make any rules that he wants so long as they don't initiate violence. The reason Putin doesn't get to make any rules he wants for Russia is because Putin has not voluntarily contracted with millions of Russians, and he hasn't acquired the property of all of Russia by himself. So I for example, was in a sober living community for some time, and there was prohibition. Now, the reason this prohibition was not immoral, well, it's even misleading to call it prohibition. This was a voluntary arrangement where we decided there should be no alcohol or drugs of any type allowed. Even though alcohol was legal, it was in America. That is a case of voluntarily having a criteria on what is done with your property. We had a big community, dozens of houses, a lot of individuals. I'd have to go back to get the number. So that the guy in charge of that, I would not consider him a king or a monarch. I would simply see it as someone who has influence and money, and a good reputation, making a contract and giving me an offer that I chose to voluntarily take. It certainly is, it's drastically different in principle, simply because you didn't acquire the property through voluntary exchange. That is the principal difference between the apartment complex having rules and the country having, quote, rules. It has nothing to do with the size. Even though the apartment complex is very, very small and the country is very, very big, if you acquire property through voluntary contract or original appropriation, meaning you just built on land that no one else was on, that gives you a better claim to anyone else. Because if someone else had a better claim, that would mean that they own your body and all the property on the land, on the earth. Once you've built something, then everyone can just take from you, and then everyone can take from them because they don't own anything. So this is why the homesteading original appropriation principle is justified, and why the ability to contract, voluntary contracts, is also vital. So when we have something like the discussion of monarchs, so long as we have the same principled understanding of private property and the non-aggression principle, there's not going to be any difference in how our societies exist, or we won't really have points of disagreement. But I do love that what Hoppe does when he talks in Democracy, the God That Failed, about monarchs being very receptive to the people. Now, because the average person says, what? The monarch, the king, can just do whatever he wants. When in reality, this is where you can appreciate the fact that all that exists is virtually the result of public opinion. The fact that people would have recognized King George as a king in Britain in 1770, but if I went to Britain and put a crown on my head and started telling people what to do, they would just laugh at me. The only difference is public opinion was in the king's favor. There are no magical powers that a monarch would have. So when Hoppe really explains to you, the king can't just do anything. I mean, he still had the ability to be assassinated. If the masses ignored him, he would have had no power. So that's where I think Hoppe's real contribution through monarchism is stated. The problem is if you have a democracy and people see government as an extension of themselves, then they will let the state get away with any atrocity, because to insult the state is to insult you. And hey, if this king is not keeping me safe, well, screw the king. He's not legitimate. Whereas when George Bush doesn't keep you safe on 9/11, you go, oh, we need to give more power to our government. And then Bush's approval rating skyrockets to 90% after not keeping the people safe that he says he's going to keep safe, regardless of what you think of that story. He didn't keep us safe. And then his power increases. Whereas any sane person, I mean, Kim Kardashian gets robbed and she fires her security. Of course, when something that bad happens, you fire the people responsible. But under democracy, when you are the government and it's the one society, it's the one mechanism in society that acts in your interests and for the public good, well, then no matter the scale of the atrocity, you think it's inherently legitimate, and you'll constantly be giving it more power. That's why democracies today tend to have more power as a percentage of the economy than kings ever did. Yeah, I think HOP is no question a net benefit to libertarianism, even though he's oddly, someone who gets criticized so much by people who are just unappreciative. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Kale wants to know, what are your views on a good state? What makes a good state?
A good state. So, there's two things. If we have, um, I think it's the Second Amendment in the American Constitution where they talk about a free state. When they're talking about a state in that case, they just mean a geographical sphere of social cooperation. That that I would say any state that that consists of adults acting in accordance with the non-aggression principle and the private property ethic of voluntary contracts is a justified state of human existence. That is not to say that any state is legitimate. So that means, the other meaning of the word state would be an organization that has a monopoly on the right to initiate aggression against peaceful individuals on and with property they did not justly acquire. So all governments, states are totally illegitimate because they claim extra rights no one else has. So if you're using the term of what state humanity is in, a justified state would be a state of freedom and equality, non-aggression principle, right to contract, right to private property, right to your own body. But there is no such thing as a more morally justified state in terms of government. That is my answer to state. If the questioner wants to clarify what they mean by the word state, well, I actually think that I answered either way you could interpret the word state.
Yeah, I think you got that one. Let's see here. Gidicus wants to know, should healthcare be state-run, good quality, and free?
Should healthcare be state-run? No. The reason nothing should be state-run is because what makes the state unique is it collects its property through coercive through the mechanism of coercion as opposed to voluntary exchange. So for the same reason, I don't have the right to forcibly take money so long as I spend a portion of it on helping other people get health care, is the same reason the state doesn't have that right to forcibly take someone's money and then maybe give them health care. Or else the solution to health care is just tell insurance companies and hospitals that they can forcibly take everyone's money. And then in exchange, they'll give you free healthcare. I certainly would like a society where people didn't have to, necessarily compensate others just so they could get something like healthcare or food or water or shelter. The problem with the idea of positive rights or the right to something is pretty much that it doesn't exist without engaging in a performative contradiction. For example, if I have a right to a house, that means other people have to have an obligation to build me a house. Whereas in the libertarian view of the world, if I have a right for people to not initiate violence against me, that puts the obligation on others to not initiate violence in the first place. That is totally consistent. But if you have an idea of people have the right to health care, well, then everyone listening to me now needs to provide me with health care, or they're violating my right to health care and they need to go to jail. But then I have to provide them health care because they have a right to it. So these are things that only come into existence because other people have taken actions to produce them. You cannot have a right to that. And also, it can't be free. Do doctors not get paid? I mean, if someone's, it's like saying, well, the military is paid for by the government, so the military's free. Because, a general has never knocked on my door and handed me a bill. So the military's free. Everything government does is free. It's just a different mechanism of paying. Now, if he is talking about a gift economy in which people do not have to directly compensate people for their labor and labor is performed voluntarily, I got no problem with that. I love that idea. Ideas, that a lot of Nikola Tesla researchers put forward, saying we could have we could give everyone a house and everyone a computer and everyone healthcare. It would be such a minimal cost that we would need only 10 people on the whole world operating machines in order to produce this. Hey, if that's voluntary, if no one's being coerced, if they're not initiating aggression, by golly, please do it. I would love to live in that world, but certainly no. I am against state run anything, especially because it's still not even free. Yep, government steals trillions of dollars a year in taxes. Certainly that wouldn't be free. And like I said earlier, for the same reason, hospitals, all they would have to do is just force you to pay. And then when you came in, they would sometimes give you something. I mean, look, right now we have free guaranteed safety by the US government through the police. Do they actually make us safe? No. Right now we have free foreign policy. Does it make us safe? Does it make other countries safe because we have free state-run foreign policy? No, it makes it much worse. Right now we have free education. Does that mean people are educated? Please, to ask that question is to answer it. So simply by the state granting something a right doesn't bring that into fruition. Telling the state passing a law saying we need healthcare and healthcare is a right does not create healthcare. It'd be like saying the idiots in Haiti who are so poor just have to pass a housing law. This way everyone has housing. And the pharaohs of Egypt should have just passed computer laws. This way everyone had a computer. No, the best way to increase people's access to goods and services, whether it's healthcare or anything else, is to make sure there's a free market where people have the ability to have conversations without coercive interference between private property owners and consenting adults. You want to make sure there's no coercive regulation at all, which drastically increases the ability of people to have access to goods and services they otherwise might not have. Very good. So that is my principled approach. The real world economic approach can easily be seen with going back to Cornelius Vanderbilt, drastically increasing the average Joe's ability to get on a steamship and travel. The Wright brothers giving us planes. We have John D. Rockefeller increasing our ability to access oil and kerosene. We have Andrew Carnegie drastically increasing our ability to access steel. And everything we have almost is either made with steel in the production process or has steel in it. So that allowed all of us to benefit. So if we really want everyone to have something like healthcare, just make sure that there are no arbitrary coercive barriers to entry, and you can increase the likelihood you'll get healthcare to the most amount of people, even at lower levels of income. That's why most people have TVs and phones, not most people in the world, but of TV owners and computer owners, tablet owners and homeowners, it's not because a law was passed. It is simply the result of people mostly acting cooperatively, voluntarily, and there being a profit incentive and competitive incentive to get products and services into the hands of the masses. Because when there's a free market in something, the goal is generally to get it to the masses. Now, cars are mostly privatized, and not all cars are, Lamborghinis. So the idea that in the private sector, it's only the rich benefit. Not even close. The average car is something much, much less expensive because they have to market to the masses of consumers. Same thing with healthcare. The best source on why healthcare is so expensive in America is a book called Death by Regulation by Mary J. Ruwart. One example of the FDA murders 100,000 Americans every single year because they outlaw the ability for people to be compensated for donating their kidney. In other words, buying kidneys, but compensated for donating sounds a lot better. In countries like Iran, where there is no such law, they have a surplus of kidneys. So, according to the researcher Jason Brennan at Georgetown University, about 100,000 Americans die annually from not being able to access kidneys, whereas there would be a surplus of available kidneys if you could compensate other people for this. So by the state coercively stopping people from engaging in this voluntary exchange, about 100,000 people die annually, again, according to Jason Brennan of Georgetown University. Is that where he works? Yeah, I think he works at Georgetown, but he's been on my show twice, and we spoke about this. So, I mean, imagine that drastically amplified. We just saw Lyft is now stopping operations in California because California is increasing the cost of production. So big companies like Lyft have trouble dealing with regulations. What do you think that does to small business? Because so many businesses have to experience this, we as consumers have less businesses to shop at. That means we have fewer access to goods and services. That means less competition. That means higher prices. That means lower quality. That means less choice for employees. They have fewer places to work. They have fewer options. It's bad for everyone when we have this type of coercive intervention. So that is my response to healthcare, why it should be privatized both economically and in principle.
All right. Jack wants to know, how do you intend to abolish or otherwise end the state? What can be done as individuals and as a collective group?
So when I say abolish the state, what I am not saying is we need to pass a law or we need to get the White House under private ownership or the Washington Monument or pass legislation to repeal the state. What I am saying by abolish the state is, well, first of all, let's talk what statism is. Statism is the belief currently in the minds of the masses that some people have the right to rule others. My solution to that is simply to change that opinion by exposing them to the nature of reality, that for the same reason scientific method applies to all objects. Objects fall at 9.8 meters per second. Morality applies consistently to human beings. So simply by changing that public opinion is where the power to abolish or end the state lies. So it's not like, I don't see ending the belief in statism as a thing that's going to happen on a day and we'll have a date. I see it as a gradual delegitimization of an idea. So just as, the example I used earlier of if I went into a certain town, even if I had a very fancy suit and a very nice looking crown, people would not recognize my right to rule them. The same reason they shouldn't recognize Trump's right to rule them, or Lindsey Graham, or President Xi of China. Just these ridiculous titles. All we have to do to end the state is recognize where the power comes from. The power is in the minds of the masses who genuinely believe that violence isn't violence when the state does it. Once we change that opinion, that's where the state loses all of its power. I mean, if we just take the American example of FDR putting 120,000 Americans, Japanese, German, and Italian, in concentration camps, how did one single person do that? All he literally did, all his actions were where he picked up a pen, just like this one, and then took a piece of paper and wrote words down, literally. I think it's like Executive Order 9036 or something. He literally wrote words down on paper, and because people believed he had the right to do that, they put hundreds of thousands of obviously innocent people in internment camps. Same thing happens with Stalin invading Ukraine, murdering millions with the Holodomor, Hitler invading countries, all the atrocities that occurred under him. So it's simply changing the idea that people have inside their head. That is where statism lives, and that's where it dies. Oh, I'm sorry. And you said, what can the individual do? James Corbett, I got to give him credit for this idea. At the end of his excellent Who is Bill Gates documentary, he says, ideas are like a virus, and to get these ideas out there, you have to come into contact with someone and, give them this idea in the same way coming into contact with someone could give them a virus. And then they might give it to maybe no one else, or they might give it to one person or 20 people. And those 20 people will give that idea to plenty of other people. So the best thing that I would recommend, and again, this is one of probably the thing that I'm most open to out of anything, is how to communicate the message, simply by explaining the consistency of of a ethical theory to people, I think will do more to end the state than virtually anything else. Having an opinion is so important, and just being able to passively articulate it. Don't be in anyone's face, because then it's odd when you're passionate about something. Instead of people saying, "Well, I care about you and you're passionate, let me listen." People tend to get so turned off and just tune you out. So if you just passively say, "I am a voluntarist. I believe all actions should be voluntary." What makes the state unique is that it doesn't engage in voluntary interactions. It claims the right to just take property by force, and they make a law and you have to abide by it. Imagine, I don't think the Pope has that right. I don't think David Miscavige, the head of Scientology, has that right. I don't think Trump has that right. And I wouldn't give Jeff Bezos that right just because every 4 years we got to vote for the head of Amazon. That's just ridiculous. So being able to easily, simply communicate that message to people, it will literally spread like a virus. And it's amazing the suppression that we get with these ideas, where it's like, I think the alt-right was a term coined in 2009, and libertarianism has been around since like 1850 with Frederick Bastiat. Really took off in the 1970s with Robert Nozick and Murray Rothbard. So if you realize that this philosophy of true natural law anarchism was very vaguely around up until the 1970s, and we've gone from 15 guys in Murray Rothbard's apartment to millions of people having conferences, podcasts, getting on Fox News, getting interviewed on the Rubin Report, having millions of views on YouTube, being on Library, BitChute. We're in such a great position historically, even though it always looks like something terrible is going to happen. So the best thing we can do is proudly, unapologetically have a general opinion that we are confident in and that we're able to communicate on principle to the average Joe. There's something really interesting in psychology. I think it's referred to as social proof, where the more people do it, the more you think it's legitimate. And I think that there's a lot of, legitimacy to that concept. Whereas when someone hears the idea of voluntarism, though that's dumb and that's just utopian and that would lead to chaos, the second time they hear the idea, they're much more likely to entertain the idea, maybe even accept it. The third, fourth, fifth, or 10th time they hear this idea, they're like, there really must be some, I got to look into this a little bit. To be fair, that's what I have done with other ideas. I'm like, well, no one really believes you just have the right to, nuke people. Then you see Lindsey Graham talking about killing all Iranians in a joking way. You see Jacob Wall talking about it like sometimes the more, and that's not me thinking that nuking civilians is legitimate. It's just the idea that it's popular. So by someone hearing something again and again and again from different sources drastically increases the likelihood they'll accept the idea. You as an individual, best thing you could do, have the opinion, be able to passively communicate it on principle to other people and explain your reasoning. Why the state's illegitimate is the really big one. Violence is violence, even when a group called Congress does it. I mean, that is the short elevator pitch that I have. So that would be my answer to, how us as individuals can hopefully change the eventual outcome of how people see the world.
All right. And Jordan wants to know, is there a preference toward religion or atheism under anarchy?
The vast majority of anarchists are atheists. And I think that's just because the people who tend to question one authority tend to question another and see it as illegitimate and an imposition on them as an individual. So even though a lot of them tend to be atheists, I see so many Christians being friendly to our ideas, because it really takes a lot of cognitive dissonance to say, God created human beings in his image, and it's legitimate to initiate violence against God's creation. Well, hold on. That certainly is creating a double standard. If I am created in God's image, how come some guy named Doug Ducey in California gets to put me in a cage for operating a business during, COVID, even when the deaths are going down drastically? What the heck is that about? Is that the Christian thing? Is that loving thy neighbor? Not exactly. So I'm very curious. If I had to bet, I would say it's more likely to occur under a Christian under a Christian society where they simply see God as the great creator of all things worth living for, and they see people as moral equals, I think it's more likely to occur. I could be totally wrong about that. That's just because most atheists are really into big government. I mean, you look at the number of progressives and socialists, and they just simply believe in a different God. Their religion is democracy, which is a belief system that so long as a mechanism of voting is occurring, or so long as something is done through the mechanism of voting, I should say, then it's totally illegitimate. They have drastically different standards. That's what makes it a religion, where there's no rational approach to anything. They just will blindly obey and have double standards, even in the face of all opposition. So, but I think a religion like Christianity or even Judaism, I don't know enough about Islam to have a developed opinion, but even Mormonism, I would say these people are just primed for anarchism. It's like God created us. That's why it's wrong for us to initiate violence. That's why everything should be voluntary between consenting adults. And people should be able to achieve their dreams without coercive interference from some other psychopath who thinks he's God trying to rule us. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. Let's embrace these ideas consistently. I could really see that going with some Christians, but then again, you get a lot of Christian idiot warmongers who will justify any amount of atrocities so long as the government does it. So that is my long, annoying answer to, I think, Christianity, but I'm open to being wrong.
All right, so in a similar vein, there's probably a term for it. I don't know what it is, but there's been an idea proffered that as society becomes less religious, the state influence or power will grow. The idea being that it's somehow baked in the cake that humans need a god, and in the absence of religion, they'll find something else. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, that definitely is consistent with what I mentioned earlier. Whereas when the state was shrinking in Russia, you had to usher in Christianity, or else Jesus knows what would have taken its place, so to speak. And when religion goes away, sometimes people exchange their, say, Catholic belief with a consistent theory of ethics, which would be libertarianism. Other times they exchange it for, now, right and wrong is not decided by the Pope. It's like, okay, that's step one. And what is decided by right and wrong is laws that are passed by this group called Congress. It's like, oh, God, you were so close. You were on the right track, but then you just fell off. So, again, very often we see people just exchanging prejudices and not having a principled difference in belief. They go from one cult to another cult to another, as opposed to really saying, you know what, cult is based in irrationality and non-consistent ethical theories. I am just going to be a non-cult member, which is the equivalent of being an anarchist. I'm not part of any group that advocates politics, which is violence by definition. So, yeah, I am totally on board with the recognition that there was a great deal of benefits that we see with, things like even the Boy Scouts. Of course, you have terrible scandals in these places like Boy Scouts and the Catholic Church. But those also occur in a lot of public schools run by the state. So, yeah, anytime people often look to something to justify their beliefs. If it's not a state, you better have something there that they can grab a hold of, or else they might very well fill it with something worse. I totally agree with that.
All right, last question we're going to take is from Dusky. He wants to know, can someone homestead the line around an entire unknown area, as in build a fence, and then demand that people pay to pass through?
Yeah. So if the building simply a fence, I don't think would justify the existence of ownership. I think it would have to be a practice of building property and being able to attend to it, or attend to it through other people, such as contractors. So, I mean, of course, you could just build a fence around the world and then say anyone who does anything has to get my permission. So no, again, this is a case of ambiguity. What does it mean to work or mix your labor? Is it building a fence? Well, no. Does it mean you have to be there every second of every day for 50 years before it's yours? Also, no. So finding a happy equilibrium, this, again, very difficult. Also, again, does not justify the existence of a state. It's hard for us to, I mean, does a state have the right to tell us, you can't travel to one place or another as they're doing now with COVID? Of course not. If we were in a left libertarian society, well, and you couldn't exclude people, well, that is you claiming ownership. For example, if I say, right now we have a place where there's a fence. If I want to go through there, that's me saying I have a right to go into or on that property. And if you forcibly stop me from going in there, well, then you're claiming ownership over it. So there is no such thing as no one having ownership, because if you stop me, you're claiming the right to that property. So someone has to, by definition of us existing, we have to make that call. So who has a better claim to it? I think the homesteading principle of mixing unowned resources with your body or the bodies of others who contract with you voluntarily is just acquisition. No, just a fence is not enough, but you also don't have to work every day for 100 years. Coming up with an exact moment at which it is now your property, where 1 second ago it previously was not, that's really difficult to come up with. In the same way, what is assault? Is patting someone on the back once assault? Well, no. Is beating the hell out of them for 30 minutes assault? Yes, obviously, at what point is, hitting them hard and it hurts? There's a lot of ambiguity in these concepts, but we still should be able to recognize the difference between someone building a fence and someone genuinely acquiring property that they are using and benefiting from, or something that they've acquired through voluntary contract. That's not. I hope that's not weaseling out of the question. You think that's enough?
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. So I know I said last question, but I'm going to throw in one more. Monday, you're having a debate here with a gentleman from the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Very often we hear, so I'm first curious, what your thoughts on that. Of course, you haven't gotten there yet, but very often socialists and Marxists will tell people you've got to read theory. I'm curious, as an ANCAP, how important is it to read theory, and what is the number one book, treatise, whatever, that you would recommend?
Ooh, number one book on anarcho-capitalism. I'm going to list off 4 that I'm in love, or a bunch that I'm in love with, and then I will pick one. A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hans Hoppe really gets into the definition of what those words mean. Socialism, the institutionalized aggression against private property. Capitalism, free market, natural law, voluntarism, is the full embracement of self-ownership and private property. That in-depth understanding, I think, is so important. That is a logical recognition of libertarianism. You also have Larkin Rose, The Most Dangerous Superstition, claiming that the belief in authority, that people have different rights than others, is a superstition, literally like a ghost being under your bed. There is no evidence that some people have the right to rule others, because if I don't have the right to do something, I don't have the right to vote for Barack Obama or Donald Trump to do it on my behalf. Another good book is Everyday Anarchy. He really takes you away from getting scared about the idea of anarchism, because the best example of anarchism is the vast majority of your interactions. Anytime you engage in a voluntary interaction that involves consenting parties, you are engaged in anarchist activities by definition of the word, and without archon and rulers. So voluntary marriage should be the rule in society, and voluntary commercial interactions should also be the rule in society. So Everyday Anarchy and the follow-up Practical Anarchy by Stefan Molyneux is another excellent book. If I had to pick one, it would be The Problem of Political Authority, an examination on the right to rule and the duty to obey by Professor of Philosophy at the University of Boulder, Colorado, Michael humor. This book simply uses a common sense morality approach. Now, just because something is common, popular, and widely recognized does not make it true or moral. However, he really gets into the ethical intuitionism of why voluntary exchanges are morally justified and state interactions are not. So, he asks, why do 535 people called Congress have the right to rule 330 million strangers? And why is it that group called government and not, a blue politics discord? What if you guys took a vote? Then would you have the right to rule, Scottsdale, Arizona, the state of Arizona, all of America, all of North America? You're just a group of people. So unless you engage in voluntary exchanges, you really don't have the right to rule other people. So that consistent approach I thought was so eye-opening. He then complements the beginning of the book at the end with talking about how this could operate in the real world. I would say Michael Huemer's The Problem of Political Authority is the treatise that I would recommend on voluntarism. And also there's an essay called Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard, which I think does another great explanation of what the state is and what the state is not, what makes it a unique institution worthy of condemnation. But I'd have to go with Michael Huemer's book because that is an actual treatise format. It's not just a brief essay like Rothbard's.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. And like I said, we'll see you again shortly on Monday. That's 8:30 British Standard Time, right?
Yes. Yeah, should be about 1 o'clock my time. I am looking forward to it. Thank you for everyone who produced questions and for everyone who took the time to listen to this. I am still on YouTube. Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. I also have accounts on BitChute, Minds, Archive.org, and Library. Everywhere it's Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for coming on and look forward to seeing you soon.
Awesome. Take care. Bye.
You too. All right, guys. So that was Keith Knight. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I see that politics chat is open, so I'm going to move down there. If you guys want to discuss, hang out, shoot the shit, I'll be in there.